as I talked about last week, Heschel is a difficult thinker to understand, to teach, because he's very much all over the place. It's very hard to pin him down what he thinks, because he is much more interested in the individual spiritual experience than in a clear theology. And I want to give you a little bit of historical background as to why this is significant in understanding Heschel. So this history will really help us appreciate him a little bit more. So if you look at the history of religion, Judaism, Christianity, really any religion, Islam too, although Islam is in a different stage of its development. But through most of history, religion and nationality were virtually the same. There was no separation between the geography, the place where somebody lived, their culture, and their religion. It was all part of one piece. So Spain, it was Catholic Spain. France was Catholic France. Germany was, Protestant Germany, and, the Lutheran variety of therein. But essentially, culture and nationality and religion were all interconnected. And you really didn't draw, there was no such thing as a separation between church and state, because they were essentially the same thing, and even in the Jewish community, this was true. Because while Jews were almost a state within a state, kind of like the ultra-Orthodox are in Israel now. They're essentially a state within a state, but this was even more formal. So within Spain, there was the Jewish, or Italy, there was the Jewish ghetto, and the rabbis and essentially a city council within the Jewish ghetto. They collected taxes, they governed morality, they governed civil law, they did burial, weddings. All of that was essentially in the hands of the religious authorities. And so there was no separation between civil life and religious life. That was true for Jews, that was true for Christians. It's still true in the Islamic world, right? Not 100%, but it's generally true in the Islamic world. But in Judaism and in Christianity, this changed. This unification between religion and culture, it's separated. And that process really begins with the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, sure you know some of this history. The Enlightenment was the beginning of sort of free thinking, the notion of reason replacing revelation, that we don't just believe something because the church tells us to believe it or because the rabbi tells us to believe it. We use our minds and reason. We have literacy. We can read books and understand what books say. The origins of the Enlightenment are in the Renaissance, which is of course spurred by the invention of the printing press. So technology always drives these movements. And the printing press is a great technology. It's just like right now, the internet is driving a new kind of separation between religion and culture. That's a whole nother topic for another day. But this technology of the printing press shifts the meaning of religion in Europe. And then eventually in other parts of the world too, but my knowledge is about Europe here. So religion and culture begin to separate. You see John Locke, Voltaire, thinkers who say that there is a religion can exist, but our religious beliefs and practices need to be based on reason. They need to have some roots in natural law, which our minds can understand. And this inevitably reduces the power and the influence of religious coercion. It just, you have Galileo, which is challenging this at the time. His story sort of represents this tension. And then the Enlightenment is complemented by political emancipation. Political emancipation is the notion that the governing authority is not the church, but is the state, and that in a modern state, in an emancipated state, multiple religions can exist together. This was absolutely brand new at the time. Again, there were pockets, in medieval Spain, there were pockets of Jews, but in general, the state had its official religion. Just like in England today, Anglicanism is still the official religion. It's not practiced it's barely practiced by anybody, but it exists. And that's the way Europe evolved, was there was generally an official religion. But over time, the influence of that official religion declined. And we see this first most prominently in the French Revolution, where the aristocracy and its sort of Catholic enablers, one could say, are overturned in favor of a secular republic. You saw even Henry VIII, starts to separate Catholicism from the state, but still there is an official English religion. But all of this is undermining the communal nature of religion. It was, you were Jewish or you were Catholic or you were Protestant in the same way you're American, you're German, you're French, whatever. It was just a core part of identity. And as the modern world emerges, there is a split in which that's just not the case. You can actually choose not to be religious at all. That was an inconceivable proposition 400 years ago. There was no such thing as a secular person 400 years ago. I know it's hard to understand that, but it's like saying we understand the notion today of a global citizen, but most people have some native homeland there. They're born somewhere. And that was the same with religion. You have some native religion. You cannot be a pure free thinker 400 years ago. Spinoza might have been the first person to try to identify that way. But today you can understand that. Religion was so much a core of a person's identity. So this happens where the secular state grows in power while the religious community declines in power. And this is true in the Christian community and in the Jewish community. That's essentially where the Reform movement comes from, is the decline in power of the traditional rabbinate. And so the decline in religion's coercive power goes hand in hand with the rise of the individual. And that is a shift in what it means to be Jewish. And that shift really starts to grow in the 19th century and then continues in the 20th century. And out of that change, there's a backlash. There is whenever there's rapid change, there's always some sort of reactionary response to it. It's like the pendulum of human nature. We see that today. It's all kinds. You have a pendulum swings far to the left side, and then you have crazy people on the right who are pushing back in extreme. You see people going to extremes. Now, going to extremes may be reaching an extreme today. No pun intended on that. It's true, but it's generally a theme of history that you have this pendulum. So in response to the Enlightenment, you have the Romantic period. The Romantic period. This is very important. So in the late 19th century, as you have the decline of religious power and the rise of state power, the rise of the individual, you also have this sense of group. We have to reinforce who we are as a group. We don't have religion to tie us together as much. So we have our ethnicity, our culture, our blood. Our blood, this is who we are. And this is the Romantic movement. And it's prominent in Germany, it's prominent in Italy, it's prominent in France. You see it in poetry. It's even prominent in Judaism. I mean, where does the Zionist movement come from? The Zionist movement is a romantic movement. It's a romantic nationalist movement. They were returning to the romance of Jewish sovereignty in the biblical homeland. There's a romantic sort of folk feeling element to it, and that sweeps Europe in the 19th century. And that romanticism, that emphasis on feeling over reason, that's what the Enlightenment was all about. Reason. The Romantic movement is all about emotion and feeling. Now, this is where Heschel is very much influenced by this romantic movement. He couldn't help it. It was in the air when he was growing up. It was in the air in Eastern Europe. By that, Heschel's born at the beginning of the 1900s. That's basically the time when the Romantic movement begins to go to Eastern Europe. It had already been in Western Europe, but it reaches where Heschel is right when he's born. And so he grows up in this sense of feeling over reason. Not that reason is unimportant, but the sense that what matters is how we feel, our spirit, our grasping. So poetry, he's a poet. He writes beautiful poetry. And that is a romantic endeavor. He's not writing Jewish legal opinions as perhaps his forebears did. He's writing religious poetry. He's writing about the prophets, who are in a sense romantic figures calling people to task for the moral law. So this then shapes the way he looks at the world. Heschel is interested in the individual and their feeling of piety, their emotional wellness. For him, a person's religious experience, their feeling, matters much more than what they believe. Their beliefs, okay, that's relatively unimportant, but can they experience awe? Can they experience wonder? Do they feel in their heart? You've heard that phrase, do you feel it in your kishkis? Just that emotional connection. That's what Heschel is looking for. And by the way, what's really interesting is that a lot of this same kind of sensibility is happening in Christianity at the same time. There was a very famous, there were two kind of figures that influenced Heschel in this regard. One of them is William James. You've probably heard of him. He was at Harvard. William James, a very prominent family. His brother, Henry James, was a great novelist. But William James was the first one of the founders of psychology, of modern psychology. And he wrote a great book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And you can tell right in the title what his goal is. It's religious experience. It's the feeling of awe and wonder. But James was also a pragmatist. James was very much a pragmatist, kind of like John Dewey. They were good friends, and James influenced John Dewey in a lot of ways. And so it was a pragmatism, a sense of religion has to speak to us in our pragmatic, modern life, but also has to evoke those meaningful experiences. And then there was another famous Christian theologian named Karl Barth. Karl Barth is a very, very important theologian. And Barth was of the opinion that we have to use our minds when reading the text, but truthfully, our first inclination should be to believe the text itself. That we shouldn't be purely critical readers. Like when you read, when scholars often read a book, they are critically unpacking. What does this book say? Who are the influences? What was the author thinking? Karl Barth said, what does this say to my spirit? That's the first question we should ask. Sure, we can talk about the author and the intellectual influences and all that. But really the first question is, how does this make me feel? And what should I do about it? How should I live my life in the context of this text? So it's a different methodological approach. And this is what Heschell feels as well. There's a beautiful, I've talked about this idea that in Judaism, there is a belief, and this is what separates Orthodox and non-Orthodox Judaism, is the idea of Torah from heaven. Torah from heaven. That the Torah comes from God. It is the word of God. Now, we may have gotten certain parts of it wrong. Heschell is not an extremist in this case, but he does believe that there is some power to Torah, that it is a result of some sort of divine encounter with God and human beings, that that's sort of a fundamental precept. God exists. This isn't just human beings writing. And in addition, the Torah, we have to approach the Torah with a certain kind of reverence and awe. Think about it this way. Many of you come to Torah study class, which is great, and it's an amazing. But if I taught Torah study, or Rabbi Ike taught Torah study, in the same way that we would do a college seminar, we would not truly be doing Torah. Because a college seminar, I mean, I guess it depends on the topic of the seminar, but a college seminar, you're meant to read text critically. You're supposed to go in with a purely rational mind, tabula rasa, a blank slate, and you have to, you're supposed to come in essentially with no preconceptions. But when we study Torah, we begin with a blessing. We start with a sense that this is a sacred text. This text matters to us more than Shakespeare matters to us, let's say. Shakespeare is fantastic. It's wonderful, but it's ultimately entertainment. It's intellectual entertainment. The Torah is something even deeper. There's a mystical power to it. We may not exactly know what that power is, and we're not Orthodox. We don't say that we have to follow every single letter and law of Torah, but it does have something special. Heschell wrote this. It's a beautiful quote. You cannot grasp the matter of the Torah from heaven unless you feel the heaven in the Torah. All temporal questions are in the context of eternity. But whoever denies the wondrous has no share in the world. How much more so can a person have no dealing with heavenly matters? If this event, that is the study of Torah, is like an everyday occurrence given to accurate apprehension and description, then it is no prophecy. But if the prophetic encounter is sublime and awesome, without parallel in the world, then it is clear that no description will do it justice, and silence becomes it. So he's essentially saying there is a power in the words of Torah that can't actually be captured in words, so it must have had some roots in this divine human encounter. There is heaven in the Torah, just as the Torah comes from heaven. Does this make sense? It's a little esoteric, I know, but the point is that there is a mysticism to it. You know, one scholar that I read, his name is Moshe Idel, and he wrote a wonderful book and talks about Heschel in it. And he says that one of the things that Heschel does is modernize mysticism. Modernize mysticism. And that he took these mystical feelings that have always been a part of Judaism, but he wrote about them in a way that appeals to the modern individual. And that's why I started with talking about the transition from a group to the individual, from the state and culture and religion all being one to religion becoming more secular or more separate from the state. Because Heschel has to speak to individuals who are unmoored from the traditional Jewish community. So he has to speak in a different tone than his ancestors. Yeah, Sue.
Thank you, Rabbi. So in listening to what you've just said in, say, the last 5 minutes or so, it makes me think about the rabbi who spoke at our synagogue on Sunday morning. And
oh, yeah, yes, very much so, Michael. Yeah, yeah,
when
very much.
When he was talking about Torah, he kept emphasizing the word story.
Yes.
It's a story. And it made me think that he doesn't really believe these are the words of God. These are human beings telling a story, but perhaps they are motivated by, a God.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. And Heschell wants to have it both ways. Heschell wants to have it both ways. He wants to say it's story and it's human beings telling story. However, the fact that these stories are so powerful means that there is some origin, that the original story came out of a divine experience, a real divine experience, that there was a moment at Sinai, at Mount Sinai, where God spoke. Maybe God only spoke one word and just said, I am. But there is some divine origin. This is why Heschel could never be considered a secular humanist. He is, and so it's story, and it's written down by human beings, but it's story that is coming forth out of an experience of a true living God. Great question. Great comment. Yeah. Marilyn. Marilyn, you can unmute.
Okay, there we go. I can do it now. Yeah. What Sue is saying, I remember when we would take Rabbi Dove's class, he would say it's our story. It's the myth that lives within us. And I always love that, and I carry that with me. But the other question I have for you is, it must have been very controversial in his time, especially with the very religious, and I'm not sure, where he fit into the, was he in the conservative or was he a Reform Jew? Because the question I'm going to ask you is, since God, those who are very religious do the mitzvot, not because it's touchy-feely and they feel good, but it's because they're commanded to do so. So this is in direct contrary to the kind of feeling. I love Heschel because I always feel if you do the mitzvah, then you feel good and you want to do more mitzvahs, but you originally do it because you're commanded to do it. And I think just the doing it is the important part. But nevertheless, how does that fit into the controversy that he must have faced?
Okay, great question. And once again, Heschel wants to have it both ways. He wants it to both be commanded and to be chosen. Now, and I'll explain why in a second, but to your first question about where does he fit in? Well, two things to understand. First, orthodoxy today is much more extreme than orthodoxy was in Heschel's life. So orthodoxy was less extreme 60 years ago, 50 years ago. I know that seems a little strange, but it's true. Most Orthodox synagogues 60 years ago had mixed seating. Again, you will not find any Orthodox synagogue today with mixed seating, but 60 years ago, many of them did, especially modern Orthodox. The ultra-Orthodox had, but there were many synagogues, Orthodox in Chicago, that had mixed seating. It doesn't exist. So there was greater flexibility. However, Heschel, though, was generally not really studied or discussed in the Orthodox community. So he was revered in some ways because of his family, he goes, I mean, his family goes back to the Baal Shem Tov, who's the founder of modern Hasidism. And so in a sense, he has this lineage that is so central to Orthodoxy that it's, you can't ignore him, but he is not considered an authority in the modern Orthodox community. In fact, there's a story about Joseph Soloveitchik, who is considered the premier modern Orthodox rabbi of the 20th century. And he wrote about Shabbat, and he gave a lecture in which he said, he talked about Heschel's book, The Sabbath, and he said, it's a beautiful book, but it's not about Sabbath. Sabbath is about the 39 categories of work that is prohibited and forbidden. That's the Sabbath. Heschel's writing beautiful poetry, but that's he would say it's sort of midrash, it's agadah, it's the fluff. It's like it's the sizzle on the steak. It's not the steak itself. The steak is the steak. Sizzle is nice, it makes it look nice, makes it smell nice, but it's not the substance. The substance, this is Soloveitchik, is the law. So that is how Heschel was kind of viewed. But he wasn't reform either, certainly wasn't reform, in that he did believe in the commandments. He believed that they were important and critical, but he had a kind of expansive view of the commandments, that they were essential, but they were more means to an end rather than ends in themselves. And that's sort of so he said, or I don't know exactly how he said it, but he would sort of evoke Shabbat. It's important to experience rest and beauty of Shabbat. And the way we do that is by following the commandments of Shabbat. But they're not ends in themselves. It's not like the whole purpose of Shabbat is not to keep the lights off. The purpose of Shabbat is to create holiness. Now, not using electricity is a path to holiness. Whereas Soloveitchik would say, no, Shabbat is about the Creator destroys, so you don't use electricity, period. That's it. So it's a different understanding of the role of the commandments. They're important for Heschel, but they're not the ends in themselves. In fact, and this is actually an interesting, one of the, as I was researching Heschel some more, one of his biggest influences is a rabbi from the 17th century named the Maharal. Now, how many of you have ever been to Prague? How many of you have been to Prague? Yeah, a lot of you. Yeah. Good. It's great. I highly advise going. It used to be cheap. I remember when I went there, I believe it was 1990. I can't remember exactly when. It was 1999 or early 2000s. I remember CDs, remember CDs? They were like $3. And in the United States, they were $12 or $15. So I remember it was cheap. I don't know if it's cheap anymore. But there was a very famous rabbi in Prague named the Maharal. And he was the one who invented the golem. If you've heard of the golem of Prague, which was essentially a ghost, not a demon, but a angelic figure who would defend the Jews against anti-Semites. And now, if you go to the Jewish quarter in Prague, they sell symbols of the golem. It was a very famous story. But the Maharal was also a very important, influential rabbi. And he was a great mystic. As you can kind of tell from the golem, the fact that he created this angelic being, he had this vision of Judaism as a wash in mysticism. In fact, there's a story about him, and I don't know whether people literally believed it or not, but that there was one Shabbat where there wasn't enough food for him and his family, so he created a calf out of nowhere and ate it. And that was the Maharal. And he wrote a lot. He wrote a lot of commentaries and books. He's the one, if you've ever heard the teaching, I'm sure I've shared it before, that you look into the Torah and you see a blueprint for the creation of the world, that the world is Torah and the world comes out of Torah. And and that everything, every single dot in letter of Torah has a correspondence in the world, in creation. And we understand the world through the lens of Torah in both a practical and a mystical way. In fact, one of the other things about the Maharal is he loved Midrash. He believed that, in a sense, the Midrash was more important than the Torah. This made him somewhat controversial. He didn't say it that way. He didn't express it so bluntly, but he believed that the Midrash was true, that these were actual stories. These events actually happened, that it wasn't just commentary. It wasn't just the work of the imagination, but it was actual reality. He believed that in a sense, he believed in miracles, one could say. There's a very famous midrash about Moses coming back to life, 1,000 years after his death, and visiting a yeshiva and seeing what was happening in the yeshiva. The Maharal believed that was actually true, that happened, that it wasn't just a commentary on how Judaism can change yet remain connected to the past. The Maharal believed this is actually true. So this is this made him a very interesting figure. Very interesting figure. His wife was also a great scholar, which was rare at the time. He had his wife. Her name was Pearl. Was a great scholar, and he believed that essentially all of Judaism is essentially infused with God and mysticism. That's how he saw the world. His great-great-grandson was one of the founders of Hasidism too. His great-grandson was Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, very, very famous, like the Baal Shem Tov. So Heschell very much is influenced by the Maharal. And so these traditional categories of law versus story, of word of God versus word of human being, these categories are not that important to Heschell. He kind of thinks that true faith and true piety transcends these categories. Here's an interesting example. There is a famous Talmudic, I bet you've never heard this before. What is the most unkosher thing in the world? What's the most unkosher thing in the world? What would you say? Well, what's the most unkosher thing? It comes to when you hear the word unkosher, what comes to mind? Is it a pig? Probably a pig. Am I right? Yeah. So there is a verse in the Talmud that says when the Messiah comes, the pig will be kosher. The pig will be kosher. If you, maybe you've never heard this. It's a very famous verse. And Heschell believed that. Heschell 100% believed that there would eventually be a kosher pig. And he writes about it. That affects his theology. That is a sense that all of the traditional categories, kosher versus not kosher, Israel versus the other nations of the world, this whole dialectic is ultimately not truly God's design, God's world. It's just the surface. Okay, questions, and then I want to look at a text. Not a text that's in the book, a different text. I'm trying to look at what influenced Heschell. And I want to share a very famous Talmudic story with you. No questions? Okay. Les, can I share screen here? Let's see. Can I do that? Good. Okay. Here we go. I'm going to share this text. Okay, I'll just read it aloud just for the sake of time. This is a very famous story from the Talmud called the Oven of Aknai. Has anyone read this story before? Anyone heard of the Oven of Aknai? Good. I don't see any hands. Okay, good. That's very good. Now you will. First, let me give you a little context. This appears in the Talmud after a beautiful verse This verse has essentially nothing to do with the story, except it comes right before the story. The verse, this is this verse right here. Rabbi Elazar says, since the day the temple was destroyed, the gates of prayer were locked. When I'm reading what the bold is what the Talmud actually says. The unbold is just the addition of the editor so that you understand the context. That's why certain things are bold. Since the temple was destroyed, the gates of prayer were locked, and prayer is not accepted as it once was, as it is stated in lament of the temple's destruction. This is the destruction of the temple in 70 CE by the Romans. Though I plead out and call out, he shuts out my prayer. Yet, despite the fact that the gates of prayer were locked with the destruction of the temple, the gates of tears were not locked, and one who cries before God may rest assured that his prayers will be answered. As it is stated, hear my prayer, Lord, and give ear to my pleading, and keep not silence at my tears. So this is a beautiful, the rabbis don't often get emotional. Here they're getting very emotional. They're essentially saying, even though the temple was destroyed, God still hears our prayers. How does God hear our prayers? Well, God sees our tears and feels, it's beautiful, isn't it? It's a very powerful text. So, but that's not our topic. That just introduces the context. This is where it starts. I don't know what this is about. This is referring back to a different text. We learn in a Mishnah, if one cut an earthenware oven widthwise into segments and placed sand between each and every segment, Rabbi Eliezer deems it ritually pure. In other words, they're koshering an oven. This is how you make an oven kosher. You place sand between the segments. Because of the sand, its legal status is not that of a complete vessel, and therefore it is not susceptible to ritual impurity. But the rabbis, these are the other rabbis in opposition to Rabbi Eliezer, deem it ritually impure, as it is functionally a complete oven. And so essentially, Rabbi Eliezer says this oven is kosher, and the other rabbis say it's not kosher. Okay. And this is known as the oven of Achnai. Achnai means snake. The Gemara asks, what is the relevance of Achnai, a snake, in this context? Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, it is characterized in that manner due to the fact that the rabbis surrounded it with their statements, like this snake, which often forms a coil when at rest, and deemed it impure. It's a beautiful image. So the rabbis surrounded this oven like a snake surrounds its prey. Now we're going to get to what that means. The sages taught on that day when they discussed this matter, Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible answers in the world to support his opinion, but the rabbis did not accept his explanations from him. So here's what they're saying. Rabbi Eliezer proved way beyond a reasonable doubt that the oven was kosher. Clearly proved it. But the other rabbis didn't care. They said, we deem it impure, and we're the majority. Now, we're going to go even more. After failing to convince the rabbis logically, so he wins the debate hands down, but they still disagree. They still don't agree to his opinion. So Rabbi Eliezer said to him, if the halakha is accordance with my opinion, this carob tree will prove it. So he's going to say, I'm going to do magic now. I'm going to show you that God is on my side, essentially. The carob tree was uprooted from its place 100 cubits, and some say 400 cubits. So he literally lifted a tree from the earth. A tree just sprouted up and jumped out of the earth. The rabbis then respond to him, they're not impressed. One does not cite halachic proof from the carob tree. In other words, so what? Okay, you can make a carob tree fly. That doesn't change our opinion. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, then the stream will prove it. The water in the stream then turned backward and began flowing in the opposite direction. So he changes the direction of a stream. He says, or God changes the direction of a stream. He says, look, I'm proving to you that I'm right. I just said, if I'm right, make the stream go backwards. And the stream started going backwards. The rabbis responded, one does not cite halach proof from a stream. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, the walls of the study hall will prove it. The walls of the study hall then leaned inward and began to fall. So the house starts to collapse. Rabbi Yehoshua scolded the walls and said to them, if Torah scholars are contending with each other in matters of halakha, what is the nature of your involvement in this dispute? So Rabbi Yehoshua starts to talk to the walls of the study hall and said, why are you getting involved? The Gemara relates, the walls did not fall because of the deference due Rabbi Yehoshua, but they did not straighten because of the deference due Rabbi Eliezer, and they remained leaning. The leaning tower of Pisa. Instead, this is the leaning walls of the study hall, the leaning walls of the yeshiva. Then Rabbi Eliezer is fed up now. He said, I have first of all, logically proven to you that I'm right. Now I've done magic tricks to prove to you that I'm right. Finally, I guess you just need to hear God say it out loud that I'm right. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. A divine voice emerged from heaven and said, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer? As the halakha is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses an opinion. Wouldn't that be nice if every time you got in an argument, a voice of God said, whenever this person speaks, he is right. That's what God just said. Now, are the rabbis going to finally admit that he is right? No. Rabbi Yehoshua stood on his feet and said, it is written, it is not in heaven. The Gemara asks, why are you saying this? What is the relevance of the phrase, it is not in heaven? Rabbi Yirmiyahu says, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we do not even care about a divine voice. As you already wrote at Mount Sinai in the Torah, after a majority to incline. So, to put this in modern English, they're saying, so what if God says Rabbi Eliezer is right? That doesn't matter because God is not the authority in this case. We are the authority. God gave us the authority to decide these matters. And in this case, the majority has decided that the oven is not kosher. So whether God says it's kosher or not, we say it's not kosher. And that's it. And then later on, the prophet Elijah or another rabbi encounters Elijah and says, hey, you remember that argument that Rabbi Eliezer had with the other rabbis and God spoke? And then the rabbi said, we don't care that God spoke. Well, how did God feel about that? And then God smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me. Is that not a wonderful story? Is that just, is that just it's a tremendous story. Tremendous story. There's a very important story. What do you think it's, and Heschell loved it. Heschell discusses it. What do you think this story is teaching? Why include this story in the Talmud? One could look at this story and say, talk about chutzpah. The rabbis are saying they don't care what God really wants. If they decide that something's kosher or not kosher, they're in charge. Who cares what God has to say? It's not that simple. What do you think the point of this story is? Any ideas? Why include this in the Talmud? Any ideas? Well, for Heschell, yeah, Sue, go ahead. Let me hear what you have to say.
Well, I'm certainly not bright enough to really ascertain exactly what this means, but to me, it kind of means that the that man may be inspired by the divine, but in the long run, it's human decision that takes precedence, and that we should know right from wrong. And that's kind of what I get out of it.
Yeah, that's great. In a sense, we have no choice but to follow human decision. You know, one of the other rabbis later says in the text that this was all a dream. That's how that this was all a dream. But the purpose of the dream is to establish that it is our obligation to figure out God's will. And there really is no such thing as a divine voice. Nobody can hear God's voice today. Maybe the prophets could, but we have an obligation or responsibility to try to interpret what it is. And that you can change, and that there's disagreement. Okay, Marilyn, then Alan.
This brings to mind Hillel and Shammai. And we learned that, you know, they had differences. And I'm not an expert on Hillel and Shammai. Perhaps you can share more about that. But, you know, we've learned over the years that let's take a parent-child relationship. If your child comes to you every minute of the day and says, which pair of shoes should I wear? What should I eat? I mean, the whole idea is to, as like Galil Gibran says, your children come through you, but they don't belong to you. Well, yes, we belong to God, but one of the things is that God gives us free will and choice. And we have to use the wisdom and use Torah to help us and guide us forevermore, and pass that on from generation to generation. And we're here for a purpose, and we have to find out what that purpose is. He speaks to us internally, and he gives us our gifts, but it's for us to have the wisdom and the desire to be the best we can be, and to be able to make decisions, because that makes us whole.
Right, very much so. Very, very, very. Hillel and Shammai are absolutely part of this. This is, and same with Akiva and Ishmael, who are, you know, the next generation after Hillel and Shammai. This goes even further than Hillel and Shammai. This goes even further in the sense that this is where God is saying there is a right answer here. I'm telling you what the right answer is. I'm telling you that Eliezer is right. It's kosher. But then the other rabbis are saying, we don't really care. We're going to decide what's right. It's in some ways very chutzpah. There's a lot of chutzpah on the part of the rabbis. So it's even more than disagreement. But it is essentially establishing what it may also be doing, and this is very much what Heschell has in mind, is it's establishing a certain kind of authority. Because one of the greatest challenges of modern Judaism, and what Heschell is struggling with, is what is the authority for religious practice? For most of Jewish history, the authority was God as interpreted by the rabbis through the Talmud, through rabbinic decisions and responsum, and that is the authority. If the rabbi says it's kosher, it's kosher. Not kosher, it's not kosher. And that's how Judaism existed through most of history. By the time Heschel's writing, even by the time he's growing up, that authority has broken down for most of the modern Jewish world. You know, people don't come to the rabbi and say, should I use birth control? Or should you know, or is this, I mean, maybe they'll come if it's a question about kosher, but people don't look, unless you're Orthodox, of course, but people don't, the authority is in the individual. The authority is in the individual. That's how Reform Judaism says we have individual autonomy. We are ultimately the authority. Sure, we might look, and so Heschel is, in a sense, trying to understand how Judaism can evolve to that place. That, in a way, we've always been evolving who the authority is. And that's what this establishes, that the rabbis, in a sense, one could say they seized authority from God. And then God, I like your analogy about the parent. In a sense, God celebrated that they had seized the authority. Yeah, Alan.
I was thinking that the one who really had the chutzpah was Eliezer, to think that he was spoken to by God. None of us are spoken to by God. And as we talk about each Shabbat, when we do the Torah study, we are left with interpretation. And so the idea that a majority should rule in terms of what the interpretation is makes a lot of sense to me. We can't talk to God. I don't think Eliezer could talk to God. So that's why I say I think that's where the chutzpah is.
Well, that's an interesting comment. I mean, so you might agree with the opinion then that this is just a dream, that this is not, that this didn't actually happen. I mean, the text seems to say it happened, but are you thinking this is just a figment of his mind, his imagination?
Yes, I've just started a class on Finnegan's Wake, which was basically all about dreams. So I'm influenced by that, but it makes sense to me that God would have appeared in a dream, because God would not appear outside of a dream.
Yeah, that's great. Great comment. Very, very great. That there's certainly another level to this. And the reason I think your comment also may be true is if God really did speak, so maybe this is all a dream, because if God really did speak in this way, it would be hard to believe that the rabbis wouldn't respect God's voice. Like, if this actually happened, it is almost inconceivable that the rabbis would go against the ruling of God. So there must be something else happening here. Either it's a dream, or it's simply some sort of legend to prove a point. Because it also seems a little outrageous that he would make a river flow backward and a tree, uproot itself from the earth. The rabbis are occasionally portrayed as miracle workers, but that's very rare. It's very, it's not a common occurrence to do miracles in Talmud. It happens, but it's rare. And usually there is some sort of divine purpose in those miracles. So even some of the miracles of Torah, Maimonides was very uncomfortable with some of the miracles. So there was I think I've talked about this once in Torah study class. There is a teaching that all of the miracles, like the splitting of the Red Sea and the plagues and all of that, all of those events were actually created on the sixth day of creation. That God, in a sense, planted into the evolution of the universe all the miracles that would happen. And that after the sixth day, there were no other miracles. Everything, it's like by the way, I'm reading a book on time, and there was a whole theory of time subscribed to by many physicists that say everything that is actually ever going to happen in the earth has actually already happened. I don't quite understand it myself, but the way time works, it's very hard to map time in the same way you can map space and all this. In any case, the events of the miraculous events were created on the last day of creation, and they're unfolding at their appropriate time. And from now on, though, nothing violates natural law. So it would seem kind of strange, and maybe a little bit, it doesn't really matter. It's not a real proof to make water flow backward. It's like almost like saying, and a 1-year-old began to read Tolstoy. Like we know that wouldn't happen. That's not going to happen. So it's just a statement of total outrageousness. That's one potential way to read it. But for Heschel, again, this establishes the authority within the person, within human beings, and that God celebrates that. God celebrates the individual experience. This is really what makes Heschel so important and modern in a way, and that he is speaking to the individual conscience. And this goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning. So it's a good place to end, is that this is what Heschel writes. Most rabbis have made the halakha primary, halakha is Jewish law, and life secondary to it. So in other words, Heschel is critiquing the Orthodox for saying the law is more important than the story. As for one who says that a certain decree or another cannot be lived with, they coerce him until he says, I am willing. I object to the provinciality of thought and to the construction of mind in all of this. This is what he writes. So he's saying, I don't, in some ways, there's a teaching from Jesus that says, man was not made for the Sabbath was made for man. I think that's how it goes. Essentially, Heschel is saying the same thing. Man was not made for the law was made for man. And that's, so in some ways, this is where he's a departure from traditional orthodoxy. One more interesting story about this. I'm reading this wonderful book about Reform and conservative Judaism. And one of the theories of conservative Judaism was that the law is still binding, that we can make modifications to the law, like there's a modification that you can drive on the Sabbath, but in general, every Jewish person is bound by the law. But what this book suggests is that that's not really what even conservative rabbis believe, that like Reform, they believe that all authority rests in the individual. And this author tells a story about a pretty well-known traditional conservative rabbi who had a congregant who said, I just had surgery, I'm in deep pain, but his wife, I think, had just died, and he had to go to Minyan for his wife. And he could walk, but it was very painful for him to walk. Should he still go to the Minyan? Now, if somebody asked me this, I'd say, no, it's okay. You can stay home and do it. If you're in pain and it's very difficult for you to walk, the point is to remember not to be in pain. But from a traditional Jewish legal perspective, unless he is totally debilitated, he is obliged to go to a minyan to say Kaddish. So this conservative rabbi was torn. He was torn. The law is pretty clear that the obligation to say Kaddish is, this is a high obligation. So what should he advise? Ultimately, this rabbi advised to say the rabbi did advise that it's fine for you to say Kaddish at home. But that's not what Jewish law would say. That's not what Jewish law would say. Jewish law would say he has to go. So Heschel, in this book, this author is essentially saying that all modern Jews, unless you're ultra-Orthodox, are essentially looking to the individual as the ultimate authority. And that's what Heschel believed as well. But every individual has a spark of God within them. And that essentially the mitzvot, the commandments, are ways of cultivating that spark. Okay, we'll get more into this next week. So wonderful to see all of you. Stay warm, be careful. The roads are not great. See you soon.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Absolutely.